Welcome to the Barden Young Tech series. My name is Catherine Drysdale and I lead the Projects Transformation and Change practice here in Barden. So today I am talking to David Sheehy, who is a full stack software developer, and he recently made the move back to Ireland from Canada. David has worked on some really interesting projects across climate science and emissions. So we will delve into that and get his perspective on the impact of technology on climate change and his vision for the future of technology. Welcome, David. It's great to have you here today.
Brilliant.
What we might do is just kick off with the first question. And just in your intro there, I mentioned some of the really interesting projects that you've actually gotten to work on, which is probably a little bit different to maybe what other people in your area of specialism might get to work on. And with that in mind, is there any specific projects you've worked on over the last couple of years that you thought could make a tangible impact?
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for having me, Catherine. Delighted to chat about it. Yeah, so when I started off my career, middle of COVID, I worked in a small startup called Ginger Tech. What we worked on was business simulation, so learning kind of key business objectives. By running a business yourself, we simulate a year in an hour. Now, that was really great for things like de-siloing and, culture and different things like that. But one thing that hadn't been done was about carbon emissions. Most companies were having to report their emissions on a yearly basis from about 2020 onwards, especially in the UK, EU, US. We built a simulation that basically said not only are there financial impacts to your business decisions, but their carbon emissions. How do you understand how they affect your business? So we built a simulation that not only made a business profitable, but made them sustainable. So it's showing the real impact of proper investments, proper business decisions to make business sustainable. That was a really cool project. As well as that, I moved to Canada in 2022. My first job there was a company called Minerva. They originally worked with mining data, but one of the offshoots of that was climate data. Basically, give me your postcode in Canada and I can tell you your wildfire risks. I was working with some brilliant people who developed maps in Canada for extreme heat risk, extreme cold, wildfire. And it was really, really important for public safety, realtors, investments, insurance, where to put the money to, make the community safe. And how to evaluate houses from all sorts of aspects. So yeah, really important projects that I love working on.
Very different to what one might normally be working in the fields that you're in. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
You actually got to work on two similar projects in two different roles. Was that quite accidental, or was it actually, did you pick that company, the second company that you'd mentioned, Minerva Intelligence, because of what they were working on?
Yes, I think that was definitely a part of the decision making. I wanted to go to Canada first of all myself, but also I wanted to work in a company that was building products that had sustainability in mind and were having a real impact. Initially, in my first role, it was all about business simulations. That then went into sustainability. But then once I got into Canada, that was my real interest. So that was one of the big attractions to work on that project for sure.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Definitely when I read your interview with Heather, I was like, this is very different to what I probably expected when I'm looking at kind of software development. Just with that in mind, actually, in terms of what your thoughts are in technology's role in addressing climate change, that is quite a broad question, but do you have any insights on that given the work that you've done in those two companies?
100% technology has a role to play, and you see the dawn of artificial intelligence being used so publicly now and so widespread. On the one hand, they have huge data center costs, like there's huge infrastructures that are being put in there that has a huge amount of energy costs. However, in terms of identifying patterns in very, very large data sets, weather patterns, long-term data sets around climate, we absolutely can use that data to help us tackle climate change and make things more sustainable. That comes down to more efficient use of energy, better traffic patterns, more how we educate students as well. How do we teach students to learn about climate change and sustainability? Like, how do we get those lessons across? I think that's really important. Technology has a huge role to play there.
That's why early education is actually a really important factor. Yeah, I think it's an important factor in a number of different ways with technology. We were talking earlier on around the impact of keeping the gender balance in STEM roles as well. So it's as important as there's a number of different factors to play there for early education. So do you think AI's growing energy demands and environmental impact should be regulated? And if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely. Regulation has a role to play. different regions of the world handle it differently. The EU, it's very regulated through the AI Act. The US are going with a more free market approach, and China, it's more tightly controlled, it's more centralized. Uh, these approaches are really interesting, and it's going to see how the results come out of them as time goes on. I think in terms of data centers in Ireland, there is a role for regulation. However, I do think there's a role for sustainable energy and sustainable data centers in Ireland. We have the highest potential for sustainable energy in Europe, and one of the highest in the world, in my opinion. So, in terms of renewable energy, Ireland has so much potential there. I think investments need to be made in providing those energy sources to fund those data centers and to encourage growth, encourage innovation. It's not a zero-sum game. We can definitely get there with time and real effort.
Yeah, no, for sure. And probably like the regulation that we had when social media first launched around the mid 2000s is significantly different to where we are now, for sure. And just, I suppose we know there is evidence, right, that platforms like YouTube or TikTok tend to push more controversial topics because that's what gets the clicks. Do you think there needs to be tighter controls within technology organizations to get more control of their algorithms so that more extremist content isn't being pushed?
Yes, absolutely. There is a role for regulation there. It can't just be a black box solution. Social media, there is a IP concern there, of course, but that doesn't mean that they can't be transparent with the public and government. There's absolutely a place for regulation there. I think it needs to be collaborative. I think you need to assume people are coming from the best of intentions and you get the best outcomes from that. In terms of engagement, that's what their main drivers are. It's different from when, 20 years ago, people were using newspapers and then their daily news to get there, and there was more area for, journalism, I suppose. So yeah, absolutely. It needs to be transparency, not a back block solution. And there's a place for regulation there, 100%.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting to understand how we're going to get to a point where regulation aligns with technology. And that's really tricky because with generative AI and the advancements in generative AI in the last year or two in particular, that's just getting a little bit more challenging for sure. I'm sure you see that kind of day to day.
Yeah.
What is your vision for the future of tech? Very broad question for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot you can talk about there. For me in particular, when I'm studying this in my master's, is around how we use generative AI, you mentioned earlier, and education. So in particular, one thing I'm working on at the moment is students, let's say, with dyslexia or ADHD or on the autistic spectrum. My own brother has autism. So providing learning experiences that enable them to get the best outcomes, that's really, really important. That's a real positive vision for the future. And that's where I see a generative AI going. That's where I'd love to see it being implemented myself.
Yeah, it's so true because the traditional way of learning just does not suit a large percentage of the population.
Absolutely.
That's really interesting. And we can see how AI has been used for such good from a medical perspective. And it's about how we can bring that into education from a positive side, right?
Yeah.
There could be huge benefit there.
Absolutely.
I suppose it's always about the balance between regulation and innovation.
Yes, absolutely.
The topic we were just talking about there. Just in terms of your career, right, was there anyone who might have influenced your passion and in technology and why you might have said, oh, that might be a career that I'd like to follow?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was in secondary school, my principal and career guidance counsellor at the time wasn't sure what to do, and he suggested I do a small coding course over the summer from fifth to sixth year. And I did it, really enjoyed the problem solving aspect of it, the fact that I could make changes, and it was, the changes were instantly there for me on the screen. That was really cool to me. So once I was in my leaving cert, I was fortunate enough to know what I wanted to do. I went to do that for in university, and loved it since. Yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting. And then you did a placement in Workday as well, didn't you?
Yes.
Was that in college that you did that?
Yes, that's right. Third year in college. Yeah, loved my time in Workday. Really great people there. Learned so much in my 9 months, and only learned more in the 9 months that I was in a work environment than in university. How teams work with each other in particular. Not even the technical side of it, just that interpersonal relations and how they work together. That was really interesting for me, and it's really important to have those personal skills in the tech industry nowadays.
Yeah, of course. And that emotional intelligence side, that
Absolutely.
comes with all careers now.
Absolutely.
We did touch on it briefly, but I know you're currently doing your Masters in AI in UL, and it's definitely an area you're very passionate about. Have you seen AI, I suppose, over the last couple of years impacting your profession, right? Maybe that's automation of those early career parts of a role. Is that something you've seen in the last kind of couple of years?
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's automated a lot of what's in my role as a full stack developer. In particular, one of the key skills for me is the ability to learn and learn technologies really quickly. That's become much more quicker in the past. I feel sorry for people coming out of university nowadays though, because often it's assumed that they don't bring enough value due to the way AI works now. That's completely not the case. I think in teams now you need a balance of experience and that kind of, fresh outlook and a fresh viewpoint from people coming out of university with new ways of thinking and new technologies. So I think there's a balance to be struck there. AI has a role, but it should be not at the expense of junior or senior people in a team.
It's interesting, is because it's definitely a topic where they're saying those early career roles, which are typically when you come out of college. And that's where you learn. That's where you learn how to interact with teams,
Absolutely.
how to be in a meeting, how to work with clients if it's a client-facing role.
Yeah.
So I think it probably, and I know you mentioned this when you were speaking to Heather, that posing the risk to critical thinking,
Yes.
and those key things that you learn in those early careers. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of plays out, especially in specific kind of areas and careers. So there probably is that risk, is that fair to say, to junior developers being replaced as they currently probably are with AI?
I think there is a risk, but I think organizations will realize sooner rather than later that that's not the best way to go. The best outcomes are going to come, as always, from a combination of junior and senior developers. You mentioned cognitive offloading is a big problem nowadays in education. There's been multiple studies done in education in particular, where students are just cognitively offloading the critical thinking aspects of what they're learning to AIs. I think AIs need to be used in a way that fosters critical thinking and doesn't just offload that. Again, there's a lot of manual process that can be automated with AI, but that critical thinking component is really key to keep within the system.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's definitely a balancing act, I would say, at the moment. Just on the topic of data, right? And this is probably quite a more general question. Do you, I suppose, worry about how your data is being used? We, every day, when we're purchasing products online, when we're signing up to things, when we're maybe sharing information for different insurance or whatever we're engaging with, does that worry you?
Yeah, absolutely. Data is the new oil nowadays, and all of our data is out there in some one way or another. As you mentioned, insurance, banking details, a subscription. Watch Netflix and so on, or newspaper and so on. It's everywhere. It's really important to understand where that data is, how it's used, and in a way that's intelligible to the wider public. It can't just be technical people or people in the industry who know about it. In particular, it's really important for vulnerable people, older people and a relative talking to them over the phone with AI and saying, my grandmother's name and so on and so forth and things like that. And in particular with vulnerable people, people with disabilities, it's important that they don't be exploited, that they're protected and that their data is protected. That's really important.
No, for sure. It's really tricky. I think we share in instances when we have to share our data, unbeknownst to us, sometimes that can be compromised. It's a really tricky topic, for sure. Look, thank you, David. That was really interesting conversation. It was really interesting to hear about your experience, especially in the area of sustainability and emissions. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for our Bargain Young Tech series, where over the last 6 weeks, we've met with a diverse number of young tech professionals. The interview series is now live on LinkedIn, Spotify and Bargain.ie.